I'm recording. Good evening, everyone. It's so great to have a nice group like this the night before Rosh Hashanah. And because there's some readings that we don't do in our particular synagogue, I thought it'd be nice to explore some of those texts. We read the traditional reading for the second day of Rosh Hashanah, which is the Akedah, the Binding of Isaac. But the first day, we don't usually read that story, which is the story of Hagar, which we're going to go through tonight. And then for the Haftorah, there are also a couple of stories that we don't look at. So this is a great occasion to focus on some of these women that we don't pay enough attention to. So what I want to do is we're going to read the story of Hagar. As you may remember, both Abraham and Sarah are unable to have a child. And so Sarah says to Abraham, take my maidservant Hagar, who's an Egyptian, and sleep with her, and then I will have a child. So that is basically surrogate motherhood, right? This is what we do today. It's not a new invention. They had it all the way back then, which was about 1800 BCE. And there were actually, they found laws that were written in the ancient Near East about how to regulate this kind of thing. Like, you know, how the child is treated as though he or she, well, he, she doesn't matter. He is going to be the heir, just as if he were, you know, born to the adoptive mother. He'll be the heir who inherits more than the second son. And then there are also regulations and laws about what happens if the surrogate mother behaves in a certain way, if she's not respectful to the adoptive mother. But the fact of having a surrogate mother is something that just happened a long time ago, and we think we invented that. So what I want you to do is to pay really close attention to the language, because we're going to read through the story, we're going to talk about it a little bit, then we're going to look at the story of the Akedah, of the Binding of Isaac. And I want you to compare and contrast them, okay? So it's really important to pay very, very close attention. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to, you know, start reading this. So this is after Hagar has given birth to a child named Ishmael, and Sarah never really adopts the kid, okay? In fact, at one point she tosses Hagar and Ishmael out, and they do come back. And now she's going to have her own child. And what's going to happen, okay? So I don't know, I remembered Sarah, so there's this theme that you'll see throughout these stories of women who are barren. And it's only when God decides to, quote, open their womb that they start being able to have a child. And remember, Sarah's about 90 years old at this point. And when she was told that she was going to have a child, she laughed. But here she is. She's going to be pregnant. And that which had been spoken, Adonai fulfilled for Sarah. I should actually show you a full screen here so it's bigger. Here we go. That's probably easier to read, huh? Okay, and Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time that God had told him. And Abraham called his son, the one born to him, whom Sarah bore to him by the name Isaac. The name Isaac in Hebrew is Yitzchak, meaning he will laugh. And that's connected to the fact that both Abraham and Sarah, on separate occasions, when they were told they were going to have a child at this very advanced age, they both laughed because, hey, you know, aren't I too old to have a kid? So that's where that name comes from. I want you to just notice something here. What do you notice about how Sarah is referred to, especially in verse 3?
Well, it's Abraham who named him.
Right.
And I'm not sure how usual that is, that the I mean, I've read about other cultures where the father has to take the baby in his arms, and that's an acceptance to the community, and that the father names the child. But we do have the story of Ruth, where the baby is born, and it's actually, who is it?
Naomi.
Naomi names the child. But I've always been under the impression that it's women who name the child.
I think it's kind of unusual. The story of Ruth is kind of unusual. But yeah, you notice that, I don't know, it starts off with God is remembering Sarah, right?
Right.
And Sarah is the subject of the verbs here, right? She,
Right.
and she conceived, she bore a son. But then all of a sudden in verse 3, not only does Abraham name the son, but the one born to him, whom Sarah bore to him. In other words, it's shifting over to the man. I just want you to notice that.
And I think that, Rabbi, that has a lot to do with the way God presented the inheritance, which is that Abraham would have a son born to him by his own loins.
Right. And remember,
a long time that should be Ishmael.
Absolutely. Yes, we'll get to that. But yeah, it's first of all, only the men are going to inherit unless there are no men to inherit, and then it'll go to the daughters, thanks to the daughters as the Zelophehad. But for the most part, it's just the men. So all right, let's go to the next verse. And Abraham circumcised Isaac, his son, at the age of 8 days, as God had commanded him. And Abraham's age was 100 years when Isaac, his son, was born to him. And Sarah said, God has brought me laughter. All who hear will laugh on my account. They're going to laugh because, hey, how did this old bag have this baby, right? The Midrash, by the way, has her so fertile and so rich with milk that she's able to give milk to all the babies of the surrounding area. But that's a Midrash. And she said, who would have told Abraham, Sarah will nurse children? And yet I've given him a son in his old age, given him a son. I don't know about her. We hope she also feels like it's her kid. And the boy grew and he was weaned. And Abraham prepared a great feast on the day of Isaac's weaning. So this is what we have to pay a lot of attention to now. So Sarah saw the Egyptian Hagar's son, the one she bore to Abraham, laughing. And she said to Abraham, expel the servant woman and her son. For the son of the servant woman will not share the inheritance with my son, not with Isaac. In Abraham's eyes, this seemed wrong for a concerned son. So what is she worried about here?
Inheritance.
And why is she worried about inheritance? We'll come back for a second.
Because the oldest son is Ishmael.
Right.
He gets, by law, he gets the grander part.
He gets twice as much, right? He gets twice as much as the next son, who's Isaac. And why does she worry about that? Is she just worried about her son getting the inheritance, or is there something else she's concerned about?
I think Sarah is troubled by putting her entire household into order. Her household is out of order. And this is one of the things, this is one of the, according to Leon Kass in the Beginning of Wisdom, this is one of the prerequisites of becoming God's people.
To have your house in order?
Putting your
Let me just ask, what else do you think she's worried about as a woman? Let's see, does somebody else have any?
Well, we know she was very worried about Hagar because Hagar was very disdainful of her when she was pregnant. And she's younger and she's prettier and she had the older son.
Okay, so there is that. There is that. I'm getting feedback.
What was that?
I'm getting feedback. Hang on a second.
Gail's phone.
Oh, it's Gail.
Gail, I'm gonna.
Okay, so, but yeah, Lynn, please.
I was thinking maybe she's worried about her own support. Like if Abraham died and she was still there, somebody would need to support her.
Yes. So women in those days were completely dependent, right, on having a man, whether it's a father, a son, a brother, somebody to take care of them. So if Abraham dies, she's going to be dependent on her son taking care of her. And if he only inherits half of what Ishmael inherits, that's a problem, right? Let me just send, can you hear us now, Gail? Can you hear? She hears. Oh, okay. Yay. Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to share the screen again and get rid of this hanging, I call it the hanging chat. It's the floating meeting controls. And unfortunately, then it goes all the way back. Okay, so we find out that Abraham was, a little troubled by this, right? I mean, here's this woman that, gave him a child, and by now Ishmael is maybe about 13, and he's not too comfortable with getting rid of her. But God says to Abraham, do not see this as a wrong act against the boy and your servant woman. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her voice, for through Isaac your seed shall go forth. This is the first time he finds out that, before this, there was like a mystery going on. Abraham is promised a seed as many as the stars in the sky, as many as the sands on the shore, and yet he has no inheritor. So the first person that we think might be the inheritor is Eliezer, his servant. But then he has his son Ishmael. So now we think, oh, maybe it's Ishmael. And then he has a second son, and now God's saying, don't worry about this. Isaac is going to be the one who's going to be, get the mantle of leadership, not Ishmael. So don't worry about what. Now, when Jill Zimmerman was the student rabbi, she suggested that what God is saying here to Abraham is not, go toss her out there, do exactly what Sarah wants you to do. What God is saying is listen to what she's really saying, right? She's distressed on some level. What is she distressed about? Maybe there's some way you can make her feel better. But of course, on a literal level, God is really saying, okay, go ahead and toss her out. Okay, now this is where I want you to be very, very close readers, okay? I'm going to read a little bit in Hebrew first because you'll see why. Vayashkem Avraham baboker, which means Abraham awoke early in the morning. Vayikach lechem v'chemat mayim vayiten el Hagar sam al shivma. So he took a bread and a skin of water to give to Hagar and placed them on her shoulder along with a boy and sent her off. And she walked and she wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And when the water skin was empty, she cast the boy under one of the bushes. So they've now run out of water and they're in the desert. And so she went and sat down at a distance as far as the shot of a bow, for she said, let me not see the child die. And she sat at a distance and raised her voice and cried. So here she is, she's out in the wilderness, and as far as she knows, the kid's gonna die. We don't really know how old he is, sometimes we're told he's 37 at this point, or 13, or we don't know, it doesn't tell us. But nonetheless, there she is in the desert, sent out there by the man who's the father to this child, and she thinks he's gonna die. And God heard the boy's voice, and a messenger of God. A messenger of God is a malach. A malach is also an angel. Malach Elohim called out to Hagar from the heavens and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the boy's voice where he is.
I have a question.
Yeah?
God didn't hear her voice.
Yeah?
He's the one that was crying, but he
Good
heard
point.
the voice
Good point.
of
You're a
God.
close reader. I appreciate that very much. You're right. He's hearing the boy's voice. Again and again, we see that, women get somehow buried under some male, but you'll see that it's not as bad as you might think by the end of the story. stand up, lift the boy, and hold strongly onto him with your hand, for I will make of him a great nation. So we know that Isaac is going to become a great nation because of Abraham. And now we also know that Ishmael is going to become a great nation.
That's from the Muslim, right?
Well, this is in our Torah, but yeah, the Muslims believe that Ishmael is the one who inherits the mantle of leadership and that he's the one who gets sacrificed up on the mountain. And God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. And she went and she filled the water skin and gave the boy a drink. So he's now saved. And God was with the boy as he grew. He made his home in the wilderness and became a shooter of the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother acquired for him a wife from the land of Egypt. Okay, so this story ends with Hagar with her son, able to pick a wife for him. He's going to have a really, important position. God speaks directly to her. And by the way, this is not the first time he speaks directly, or God speaks directly to her in Genesis 16, the first time she was tossed away, and tells her to go back. Whereas, how does Sarah speak to God? Anybody remember? How does she find out that she's going to have a child?
She laughs at God. She laughs when she hears it.
Right, but does God tell her directly?
No.
She's
Lynn?
eavesdropping.
The
She
angels.
has to eavesdrop. She has to eavesdrop in order to get the message, right? She's in the tent and the angels are coming and they come and tell Abraham, you're going to have a son. And she eavesdrops, oh, and that's when she laughs, but she's not told directly. Hagar is told directly. And I've told the story to some of you before, which is that my wonderful teacher and friend, Dr. Rachel Adler, was initially married to an Orthodox rabbi. And they used to, the rabbi and his friends used to sit around studying, Lynn remembers, I see from the smile. They used to sit around studying Talmud together. And she used to listen in from the kitchen. And when they were done, she would go and pick up the books and recreate the discussion for herself. So if you think listening at the tent is something from 1800 BCE, think again, this was not that long ago, okay? So that's often what happens, I remember maybe you guys remember this too, when I was growing up, my parents, a lot of times the men and the women went to separate rooms, right? And the women would talk about, kitchen matters, probably more than anything else. And no men would go in there and participate in those discussions. So this is really picking up on something real, but I want you to notice the difference. We can't go through the whole Torah right now, but when Sarah is told you're going to have a child, she is not in direct contact with God. She never is. Hagar is. And there's a reason I want you to pay attention to that. Before we go on to the next story, I like, because we're going to compare it to the next story. Any other comments or questions about Hagar and Abraham and Sarah?
Well, there seems to me there are a couple of times in the beginning of Genesis when Abraham is very passive, and he does things that ordinarily would be considered crazy,
Yeah.
sending his son and the mother out into the desert with water and bread,
Yeah,
and then taking his son up and sacrificing him.
yeah.
But yet later on, I don't know if we're going to explore any of that, but he becomes a lot less passive. Certainly
what's
in Sodom
interesting?
and Gomorrah, he becomes a lot
What's
less
interesting?
passive.
This is what's interesting. Sodom and Gomorrah happens before the Akedah. When he's actively arguing with God, that happens before he agrees to take his son up without a word. That's a real brain twister right there. Because you would think the evolution is passive and then speak up, right? But that's not what happens. Although, as I've said before, according to Rashi, there's no before or after in the Torah, so you could flip around. But it is, of course, there's a whole discussion about this throughout hundreds of years about why is he able to speak up for Sodom and Gomorrah and not for his own son? But that's for a different class because we're focusing on the women here. But it's a very interesting question. So I want you to sort of have this in your mind, this story in your mind, as we are going to look at the Akedah, although we're not going to go into a lot of interpretations of the Akedah. I want to compare it to this other story. But before we go there, I just want to see, does anybody have any questions about Hagar? It makes you wonder about more, let's say Mormons who had several wives, how that works. Here just with 2 wives, it's pretty tough. Any other questions?
I think we need to take a look at this whole issue of circumcision that has been in these pages, but we really haven't addressed them. Ishmael was circumcised when he was 13 years old.
Yeah.
And Abraham's name was changed at that point, as I believe, from Avram to Avraham. And this is the first sign of the covenant. Isaac, Yitzhak, was circumcised when he was 8 days old. Another sign of the covenant, and I haven't yet worked out, what the repercussions of this are on the family of Abraham.
Okay, that's something to think about.
Hagar.
Something to definitely think about. What's interesting, okay, so as you said, when this covenant of circumcision is, worked out between God and Abraham. So Abraham's name is changed from Avram to Avraham.
Mm-hmm.
And Sarah's name is changed from Sarai to Sarah. So the Hey, which represents God, is added to their names. And when I was teaching this to some 6-year-olds, I said, so when you change Avram to Avraham, what's added? And one of them said Ham. Kids are great. Okay, so I'm going to now share the next piece. Get rid of the hanging Chad. Okay, so we go to the next story. So this is the binding of Isaac, which, I'm sure you're familiar with, and this is what we read on Rosh Hashanah, which will be Saturday morning. So it was after these events, that God put Abraham to the test. Now, we don't know when it says after these things in Hebrew, Achar hadavarim ha'ele. We're not sure what these things are. This comes, after the story of Hagar, but there's some other stuff in between. So we're not really sure. And according to tradition, God puts Abraham through 10 tests. And this is the last one. And God said to Abraham, and he said, here I am. So Hineni, right? I'm ready to serve. And God said, come, take your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac, and go forth to the land of Moriah to offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you. So, we did have a session on the Akedah. We went into some detail about it, but we can't do that right now. Now, watch this. Vayashkem Avraham baboker. And Abraham arose early in the morning. Does that sound familiar? Okay, that's how the story with Hagar started. He got up early in the morning, the very exact same words in Hebrew, okay? And harnessed his donkey and took with him his 2 young servants and his son Isaac. And he split the burnt offering wood and rose and departed for the place that God had said to him. Okay, now, very careful about On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place in the distance. And Abraham said to his young servants, you stay here with the donkey while the boy and I go further on. We will worship and return to you. And Abraham took the burnt offering wood and placed it on his son Isaac. Remember in the story with Hagar, he places the stuff on her as well, on her back. And took in his own hand the firestone and the knife, and the 2 of them walked together. And Isaac said to his father, he said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Again, Hineni. And he said, here is the firestone and here's the wood, but where is the sheep for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will see to the sheep for a burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them walked together. So, there's a whole discussion about, well, what does he mean God will see to this? Is this because he really trusts that God will see to it? Is he lying to Isaac? It's not clear. There's a lot of things we could say about this, but we're not going to focus on that tonight. And they came to the place that God had said to him, and there Abraham built the altar and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar over the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And a messenger of Adonai called to him from heaven. Look at what it says. Malach. Now here it says Malach Adonai. The other one said Malach Elohim. So a messenger, an angel, Malach, comes to speak to him just as Malach came to speak to Hagar. Okay? Saying, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. So there's a lot of discussion about why he says Abraham twice. Is it because Abraham is so intent on killing his son he can't hear it? Okay, again, for another discussion.
It doesn't say anything about the boy about Isaac saying anything. Like what
Isaac says nothing. In fact, in the Middle Ages, the story is that Isaac actually says, please, tie me up so I don't fight back because I want to be able to do this for Kiddush Hashem, to honor and give sanctification to God's name. And actually, I think there's some scholarship saying that actually the first level of the story is that he actually did get killed and then he was sort of resurrected. Whole other discussion. My main point of showing this is to compare it to the other story. So the messenger says, do not lay your hand on the boy. Do nothing to him for now. I know that you are in awe of God, since you would not deny me your son, your only one. Now look at this. And Abraham lifted his eyes, and suddenly he saw in the thicket a ram caught by its horns. And Abraham took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Okay, remember? Hagar looked up, and what did she see? What did Hagar see when she looked up?
The well.
The well, okay? I'm just trying to show you some parallels here, and then we'll discuss what that's about. And Abraham called that place by the name Adonai Yireh, Adonai will see. And then a messenger of Adonai called to Abraham from heaven a second time. Because you've acted this way and you wouldn't deny me your son, I will bless you greatly. I will multiply your seed like stars in the sky, etc. And then verse 19, and Abraham returned to his young servants, and they rose, and together they walked to Beersheba. And Abraham dwelt in Beersheba. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. And so let's look at the parallels between these two stories. Okay, in both stories, Abraham gets up early in the morning. In both stories, he puts whatever it is on the kid or on Hagar, right? In both stories, the child is about to die. And at the very, very last minute, Hagar sees the water, Abraham sees the ram, after a messenger of God, a malach, an angel, comes and says, whoa, not so fast. What do you think the reason is for these parallels? What do you think that's about?
Both sons are ready to be sacrificed.
Okay.
They're ready, but they're the victims or the potential victims of sacrifice.
Okay. What else? Do you think there's a moral to the story, to the comparison?
It seems to me that there's such a fundamental difference, though, between the two, because Hagar has brought her son into the desert and they run out of water. She leaves him there and she goes off to sort of mourn him because she knows he's going to die, whereas Abraham is picking up a knife and is prepared to kill his son, to sacrifice his son. And the difference between mourning the fact that your son is going to die because the water is all used up is very different from picking up a knife.
Okay, that's a good point. Good point. Any other thoughts about why these are two parallel stories?
Both Hagar and Abraham see the solution as a miracle.
Okay.
I mean, Abraham sees the ram, Hagar sees the well. They may
Okay.
have been actually in front of them all the time,
Sure.
but they did not see them until God opened their eyes.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I was just gonna say that they both are sort of requiring an ultimate sacrifice of a parent, sort of at both, like sort of the parallel of sort of giving up the most at at a critical juncture for both of them. They come, I agree, Laura, that they come through very different. You know, one's about to kill, one's letting a child die, but there's like because of sort of circumstances they really couldn't control that they're doing this, and they're both sort of at the exact same moment. So it's I'd never seen that. It's really
Okay. Yes, Barbara.
Perhaps God is always testing
That's for sure.
and continues to do so.
Okay, good. All right. So those are all great comments. Look at the ending. How does each story end? What happens in the story of Hagar and Ishmael? How does it end?
She finds him a wife
She finds him a wife. They're together, right?
in Egypt.
Right.
What
But
happens at the
Abraham and Isaac are not together.
They're never together again until he comes to his funeral. So let me tell you what my theory is, because I actually wrote a paper about this. So the whole issue of Abraham and Sarah. Okay, there are 4 parents, right? We say a blessing about them every day, 3 times a day in the Amidah, right? Because of their merit, please be good to us, God, right? The Avot v'Imahot. All right, every single day we say this. However, as we probably all know by now from all the studies we've done of the Torah and the rest of the Bible, our heroes are definitely very, very flawed. And the Bible does not mince any words about it. You know, I mean, they're all shown in their, like when Ezra was saying before, Abraham did some things that were questionable. You know, he also passed his sister off as his wife as his sister on 2 occasions. And the rabbis are so disturbed by this that they say, well, you know, they really are kind of half brother and half sister. Well, there's no evidence of that. They just make that up. So he doesn't have to really be lying. He does ask Sarah's permission. Can I please say that you're my sister? But nonetheless, he's exposing her to a lot of danger by sticking her in a harem with the Pharaoh's, you know, various wives. All right, so you have Abraham and Sarah have this Egyptian woman working for them, having a child for them, and they stick her out in the desert to die and Ishmael to die. That's pretty horrible. And she is put through an ordeal where she has to watch as her son is going to possibly die. A horrible ordeal for a parent, as many of you know. Some of you have experienced that yourselves. So when God puts Abraham to the test after these things, I believe, and some other scholars believe, that God is putting Abraham and Sarah through the exact same ordeal that Abraham and Sarah put Hagar through.
Like revenge?
Well, not so much revenge, but look what you did to this woman. And so that I think they're very, very close parallels between the 2 stories. I pointed a few of them out to you. You know, we're like Vayashkem baboker, which means he got up early in the morning, is a very rare expression in the Torah. It's used in both cases. Opening the eyes after a malach comes out. I mean, they're just things that are very specific to these 2 stories. So, you know, remember the story of Jacob. Jacob was a trickster, right? He kind of tricked his brother into selling his birthright for a bowl of soup. He tricked his father into giving the blessing of the firstborn to him instead of to his brother Esau, right? He's a trickster. Now he gets tricked in the next scene, which is when his father-in-law switches the woman that he's been working for 7 years to marry with another woman, right? He's supposed to marry Rachel. The father-in-law sticks Leah in the bed. Okay? So he gets tricked because he's a trickster. He becomes one of our forefathers. Okay, terrific. But he has to pay some price. Well, here are Abraham and Sarah putting somebody through a horrible ordeal. So God says, okay, you want to know what that's like? Here you go. Okay. Now, neither one dies in the end, but now, interestingly, I was pointing out before that Hagar actually has a direct relationship with God. Sarah does not. And she gets to stay with her son. She gets to pick her son's wife. Whereas Abraham comes down the mountain without his son. He never sees him again. The next story after this is the story of Sarah being dead, which the rabbis interpret as she had a heart attack when she found out what happened. So they actually get punished more severely by the end of the story, whereas Hagar is able to be with her son and to help him flourish and, you know, be the father of many generations. So I think that's the Torah's way of saying, you know, you can't just get away with murder. At some point, you're going to pay the price. And I think that, to me, is a very important and powerful lesson, that, you know, there is some justice out there. It may not happen immediately. It may not happen in the way you expect it, but it's going to happen in some way. You know, like karma, right? You put out the karma, it's going to come back to you. So I did a whole analysis of the two stories and, you know, drew parallels in terms of the structure and the wording and all of that. And I mean, as I said, there are other scholars who, not that I'm a scholar, but there are other scholars who've also indicated that this was it's really hard to avoid it once you notice these things. It's hard to avoid that there's such strong parallels that there must be some reason for these two things to be so closely connected.
And do you think that the repercussions went into the next generation with Isaac's children?
Oh, well, Isaac, first of all, is a broken person. Just imagine, you know, being up there with your father having a knife like this. She's a very weak person. So Rebecca, his wife, is the one who really runs things. You know, Jacob is a trickster, and, you know, they're definitely, and Jacob ends up,
Jacob has to leave. The favorite son has to leave. But
And
that's more of a punishment for the mother than the father.
oh, before we go on to the next one, there are a couple of commentaries from the Mahzor that I wanted to look at. Okay. So yeah, one of the questions is, why is it that Rabbi use these stories for the high holidays? I don't have the answer, and there are all these various explanations, but here are some. The Torah readings chosen by our sages for Rosh Hashanah highlight central themes of the days of awe. These are, first of all, stories about moral choices, individuals confronted with difficult decisions, competing loyalties, and conflicts of interest. Genesis 21, the traditional reading for the first day of Rosh Hashanah, centers on the troubled relationship of Sarah, Hagar, and Abraham. Genesis 22, the traditional reading for the second day, presents the story of Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, in which God asks Abraham to offer his beloved son on Mount Moriah. Rather than moral exemplars, the Torah presents awed human beings wrestling with intense emotions, love and fear, anger and jealousy, fervent faith, and profound self-doubt. Their struggles remind us of our own complex family dynamics and personal dilemmas. In this season of self-reflection, we're drawn into stories that demonstrate the challenges of discerning God's voice and choosing the right path. Both stories center on a dramatic moment in which the characters' eyes are open to reveal a new direction for their lives. Hagar sees a well in the wilderness. Abraham sees a ram caught in the thicket. This change in perception, this instant of renewed vision, holds a promise that we too might discover new possibilities and resources for our lives as we contemplate the year ahead. So somebody said something about seeing something that they hadn't seen before. Who said that? Oh, Alejandra, right. So you see that this is similar to what the commentary is, that, you know, they're sort of avoiding the really difficult issue about this Akedat Yitzchak, which is the story of the binding of Isaac. I mean, there's some really difficult, you know, parts to that, but, you know, it is true that it is confronting people with moral choices. You know, is your faith more important than your children and your family? Do you really hear God's voice? But also that, you know, he thought, I have to do this thing. Or Hagar thought, my child is going to have to die. And then there's an opening that they hadn't been aware of before. And suddenly there's a different way of doing this. And that's kind of what I think the high holidays are about, right? It's about, we've been in a certain pattern of behavior, and now we're starting to look at how the behavior can be different if it's been problematic, right? Can we do it in a different way? You know, if there's a wall, is there a way around it? Or is there a door somewhere that we hadn't seen before? So I think that's a very nice reading of it. Any other thoughts about that? Why were these chosen for Rosh Hashanah?
We're supposed to be
One
thinking
thing
about,
that,
Wait, let's start with Sandy and then Ezra.
we're supposed to be thinking about our behavior in the future
Mm-hmm.
and how we're going to, attack things during the new year.
Right.
And so we're seeing how they behaved towards the future.
Right. Yeah, certainly the future is represented by their children. So, yeah, good. Okay. Ezra?
well, so something that just occurred to me is that in the beginning of the Torah, God is promising, I will make you a great people. Is that Ali again? Oh, that's okay. Men, what are you going to do? But God keeps promising, I'm going to make you a great people, and more than the grains of sand and the world. It takes a long time before God decides, or at least makes it plain, what is it to be a good people, a holy people?
Yeah, good
We
point.
go through this building up of you're going to have an empire.
Yeah, it's a
Nations
long
will bow
journey.
down to you, but nowhere is it said do the right thing. It takes a long time before we get to do the right thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, there's a lot to be said about these stories, a lot more, but, this is just sort of an introduction. We had a whole session on the Akedah. If anybody's interested, it's up on our YouTube channel. And I mean, I've sat in on 2 more sessions on the Akedah taught by other people, and it was like, wow, I didn't even see that. There's so much that can be said about that story. It's amazing. But we're going to go on to the next woman, who is Hannah.
Mm.
Let me, as I said, I have to get rid of the hanging chat each time. Okay, let's see. Oh, there's one more slide. Most of all, these are stories that affirm life. Well, I don't know. Okay, they all get saved in the end, but affirming life, I'm not so sure. Okay, let's go to, oh dear, there's so many commentaries. Wait, I want to get, okay, here we are. Okay. So this is one that we replace the, this reading, well, this is for the first day, and then there's one for the second day. We replace this with the story from Nehemiah, which is the story of Ezra bringing the scroll back to Jerusalem, and it happens to be on Rosh Hashanah, but these are the more traditional readings. So this one is about Hannah. So there was a man from Ramat Yamim Sophim from the hills of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, God creates, son of Yeroham, son of Eliah, etc. He had 2 wives. Here we go again, right? One named Hannah, Grace, and the other named Penina, Pearl. Jacob had 2 wives too. Remember, one was beloved and one wasn't. He loved Rachel. He wasn't so thrilled with Leah. Of course, Penina had children and Hannah had no children. This is the same theme. Jacob had 2 wives. The unbeloved one, Leah, had children. Rachel didn't have a child until much later. Abraham had Hagar, who had a child, and Sarah, who didn't until much later. So it's the same theme of the not so beloved wife having the kids and the beloved wife not. And this man would go up from his town every year to worship at Shiloh and make offerings to the Eternal of Heaven's hosts. And there Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Pinchas, were priests of the Eternal. And on the day when Elkanah would make offerings, he would give portions to his wife Penina and to each of her sons and daughters. And to Hannah, he would give a special portion because he loved Hannah, and the Eternal had closed her womb. And her rival wife would taunt her cruelly to make her tremble with grief, for the Eternal had closed her womb. And so it was year after year. When she would go up to the house of the Eternal, she taunted her and she would cry and not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you cry? And why do you not eat? And why are you disheartened? Am I not worth more to you than 10 sons? Remember, whoever brought up Esther, remember when Naomi had a baby and Ruth, and, you know, Ruth is better to you than 7 sons. I mean, you know, they could, oh, you know, the more sons you have, the better. But here he's saying, well, you know, I'm great. What do you need kids for? Jacob says the same thing to Rachel, by the way. Remember? She gets upset because she doesn't have children. And when she cries about it, you know, Jacob says, you know, what's your problem? Okay, and Hannah arose after eating and drinking, and while Eli the priest sat upon the throne near the doorpost of the temple, and she, bitter to the core, prayed to God, weeping and crying. So she's upset. She goes to the temple, and she's crying. And there is the high priest sitting on his little throne. What do you think he's going to say to her? She vowed and said, Eternal of heaven's hosts, if you will truly see your servant's affliction and remember me and not forget your servant and give your servant a son, I will give him to the Eternal all the days of his life, and no razor should be lifted to his head. So in other words, he's going to become a Nazarite, which is a kind of Jewish monk. And normally a Nazarite doesn't serve more than 7 years, but here she's saying he's going to be yours forever. Another kind of sacrifice, really, right? If I have a son, I'll sacrifice him to God. I mean, he'll be alive, but I'll see him once a year. And as her praying before God intensified, Eli watched her mouth. And Hannah, she was speaking only in her heart, though her lips were moving, her voice could not be heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. And he said to her, how long will you persist in drunkenness? Put away your wine, get rid of it. So of course, if a woman is in there praying, she must be drunk. What else would she be doing there, right? And Hannah answered, oops, it keeps doing this. It's really, okay. No, my Lord, a woman of sorrow am I. I drank neither wine nor spirits, but poured out my soul before the Eternal. Do not take your servant for a worthless woman. All this time, I have spoken from the depth of my anger, from the greatness of my grievance. And Eli answered and said, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant the request you have made. And she said, may your servant find grace in your sight. And the woman went on her way, and she ate, and her face was no longer as it had been. Interesting story here, right? Similarities to the Hagar story. And similar story to the Hagar and the Akedah about sacrificing your child, which I think, to be generous about the interpretation, think of it as being able to overcome your selfishness on some level, maybe, and being open enough to God that you can set aside your own needs. It's the Akedah is a very disturbing story. There's no question about it, but let's try to be a little more generous about it. So again, the high priest is very condescending to her. However, interestingly, the rabbis, when they determine how you're supposed to pray, they use Hannah as the model, because she's praying from her heart, and that's what they think is important about prayer, that you pray from your heart. And so they kind of redeem her after this guy acts like a jerk. Let's look at some commentary on that, which I will. Okay, so, and by the way, of course she does have a son, and she does give him to, but we're not going to go through the whole story. Okay, so every time we blow the shofar, we say, Hayom Harat Olam, today the world is born anew. These words recited after the shofar is sounded underscore a central theme of Rosh Hashanah, creation and the renewal of all life. The traditional Torah reading for the first day of Rosh Hashanah accentuates this message. That was the story of Hagar. I'm not so totally sure that's true, but okay, we'll take that, their word on it. Okay, So too, the Haftarah chosen by our sages for the first day of Rosh Hashanah recounts the story of a barren woman whose prayers are answered by the birth of a child. So, God intervenes. Hannah, a woman of deep piety and spiritual grace, her name means grace, presents a model of heartfelt prayer and integrity that contrasts sharply with the behavior of Eli the high priest. Hannah cries out to God in bitterness of spirit, and she's given life. Like her, we come together on Rosh Hashanah to seek renewed life and hope, to pray that we might transcend our pain and transform our lives. On Rosh Hashanah, the day of remembrance, God remembered Sarah, answering her prayer for a child. On this day, Rachel was remembered, and on this day also, Hannah remembered. Okay, we'll get back to that in a minute because I think this is kind of problematic, but we'll get back to it. Okay, so now Hannah was praying in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. Rabbi Hanuna said, how many important laws we can learn from these verses relating to Hannah. From this, we learn that one who prays must direct the heart, i.e. pray with focused intention. Only her lips moves. From this, we learn that one who prays must pronounce the words distinctly with the lips, but her voice could not be heard. From this, we learn that it is forbidden to raise one's voice too loudly during the tefillah. That's the Amidah, the one that has 7 blessings on Shabbat. Of all the petitions, prayers, and psalms in the Bible, mostly uttered by men, it is the woman's heartfelt plea to God that was singled out by our sages as a model and prototype of all prayers to come. Okay, so the thing that's problematic to me about this commentary, and also what we learn from these stories, is that here are 3 barren women. You'll see Rachel in a moment. Yes, we have time to do Rachel. So you have these 3 barren women who pray to God, and God answers their prayers. Well, what happens to people out there who really want children and can't have them, no matter how much they pray? So I think this could be very hurtful to people, reading this story and thinking, wow, maybe I didn't pray hard enough, or maybe I'm not deserving enough to have a child. So on that level, I find it problematic. On another level, if we talk about Rosh Hashanah as a renewal of life, then we can take it on a more figurative level. Okay, I want a new life at Rosh Hashanah. I want to change some of my behaviors. I want to change some of the ways in which, my life is going. And there is always, always, always that possibility, right? The whole idea of teshuvah, right? Teshuvah, very badly translated as repentance. Teshuvah really means return to the right path. We always have that option, right? We always, always have that option. And the high holidays is a time when it's more intense, but it can happen anytime. And we can find new ways and new opportunities if we open our eyes to them. If you think about the story of Moses at the burning bush, Moses is walking along and he notices that the bush is not burning. I mean, it's sending off smoke, but it's not burning up. And he turns aside to look at it. In other words, he gets off his path to look at this thing. Now, I'm sure there were other shepherds who had been going through that area and saw this bush with flames coming out and just didn't even pay attention. The idea is to pay attention. And when he paid attention, he turned aside and then God spoke to him. So we have to pay attention. When Hagar and when Abraham opened their eyes, they saw another way. But God doesn't just jump out at you. God doesn't say, here I am. We have to engage. And I think that's what these stories are trying to tell us, among many other things. So I'd like to think about the story about barrenness and fertility, not as about an actual child so much as about the fertility of a new way of life or a new beginning, which is what Rosh Hashanah is supposed to be about. Any responses, comments, disagreements? Yes, Sarah, Sandy.
Is it possible
Okay.
that,
Sandy, first Sandy and then Jane, okay?
Okay.
is it possible that he was the only one that saw the burning bush, that it was invisible to
I think.
other shepherds.
Okay, that is certainly a possibility. That is certainly a possibility.
It was a miracle, and they didn't deserve to see this miracle.
Okay, that is certainly a way to understand it. What were you going to say, Jane?
My question is really about tikkun olam and when that becomes part of our thinking. I'm not sure. I think this is a modern idea. But for the people who pray to have a child, I think adoption is one of the ways that you heal the world.
Okay, so
It's another option for healing the world,
I agree.
which
but-
in a sense is a greater message than what we're just getting through Rosh Hashanah.
Okay, so I don't disagree with you, but I can tell you, we have some friends.
Mhm.
She wanted a child really, really badly.
I understand.
Okay, they couldn't have a child. She went through fertility treatment. That didn't work. They found a surrogate mother, and the woman changed her mind at the last
Right.
minute. I mean, on, and they don't want to adopt for whatever reason. So I'm just saying, this can be very painful for people.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
And yes, adoption is certainly an option if that's something you want to do. Sometimes there are also issues around adoption, you know?
Mhm.
So and yes, it's a tikkun olam, I think, to adopt a child, absolutely, give them a home, but it's not an option for everybody for one reason or another, So it's like Judaism emphasizes a great deal having children, be fruitful and multiply, right? And rabbis will often give sermons about that. And I know how painful that is for people who don't have children, either because they've made the choice or because they can't. And so I just want to be sensitive to that because, I don't want to push a message that doesn't resonate with people or that hurts them, It's like the Unatana Tokef, right? I mean, who shall live and who shall die, especially this year. Wow. People don't necessarily want to hear that or hear it as judgment against them, And so again, the idea that the bush appeared only to a deserving person, maybe. But again, that's very painful for someone who thinks, well, why am I not deserving? Why am I getting cancer this year? Why am I getting COVID? Why didn't I see the bush? So I think it's just trying to be sensitive to those kinds of things. Now, when I've told the story about Moses in the bush, I also tell this other story, which I used for a sermon many years ago, which is, you may be familiar with the story. It's a story from the Washington Post, probably about 10 years ago. The Washington Post wanted to see whether art could be appreciated out of the context of a museum or a concert hall. So they took Joshua Bell, Joshua Bell, who is a premier violin player. He wore a baseball cap and just, a t-shirt, whatever. And he went into the Washington DC subway. And he played some amazing piece by Bach with a Stradivarius, okay? And they were trying to figure out crowd control. How are we going to control the crowds? Because normally, if you want to see Joshua Bell, you're going to spend a lot of money for a ticket. But here he was for free in the subway. What happened?
People ignored him. Because he looked like a bum.
Exactly. They ignored him. It was like, I have to get to work. I don't have time for this. There was one group of people that didn't ignore him.
Children.
Exactly. Children who were not, sort of, on a path to work or whatever, who still were innocent enough and open enough to hearing beautiful music. So the parallel to me, and I'm not denying that your interpretation is valid, it absolutely is. But I think that a lot of times we don't notice our blessings and we don't notice the opportunities around us because we're so, like horses with the blinders, right? We have to get to work, we have to get to school, we have to, okay, Sandy and then Angela, go ahead.
Haven't you ever been looking for something and you don't see anything else? You just see, you don't see the thing you're looking for.
Absolutely.
It's the only thing you're focused on. and horrible things could be going on half the time, but
Absolutely. Absolutely. Or you can be looking so hard for your glasses and you don't know where they are and they're right there sitting on your desk. Okay.
no, they're on your head.
They're on your head. Yes. Okay. Angela.
Well, I think that it also goes the other direction. You often don't see your blessings, but you also often don't see the challenges that the people around you are going through.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, yeah. Randy.
The things that I've learned from the Epicurean empiric community is when the Shema is signed, the sign "pay attention" is used for heed. Hello, are you out there? You know,
Good.
rather than hear, because it's not a literal listening. It's I'm focused. I am zeroed in. I am centered on what it is that God is saying. So,
Nice. Nice.
attention.
Yeah. It's here as in listen, like pay attention, right? That's the watchword of our faith. Pay attention. We're saying God is one. What does that mean? God is our God. God is one. You know, there are a lot of ways of interpreting that, but pay attention to the people around you. And you know, we often make assumptions about people. Oh, that person didn't call me back because they don't like me, or they didn't call me back because they're, you know, rude. Well, maybe they were going through some horrible thing that they, you know, consumed their energy and their time and they couldn't do it, right? So it's hard a lot of times not, you know, to sort of take a step back and say, wait a second, let's not get all emotional about this. Maybe there's some other explanation. Absolutely. Any other comments before we go on to the last lady? Okay, so we're good. Oh, wait, there's something in the chat. Oh, Regina left, unfortunately. Okay, Regina had to leave, and also Gail seems to have gotten knocked off altogether, but
And
I'll send-
Susie's gone too.
oh, okay. Well, I'll send them the recording if they really want to continue. All right, so. All right, we have to go beyond this to, all right. This is the reading, the Haftorah reading for the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And it's from Jeremiah, as you see, and it's about Rachel. And it's what's called a nechemta. A nechemta is a kind of, what's the word in English? Kind of trying to make you feel better. I can't think of the right word. You know, the prophets will often go out there and tell you all the terrible things you've done and all the punishments that will ensue as a result of that. But then at the end, or somewhere along the way, they try to make you feel a little bit better. Things aren't going to be that bad. There's going to be some consolation, right. So thus said the Eternal, a people survivors of the sword gained grace in the wilderness. Long ago, when Israel was on its journey home, the Eternal appeared and said, with an everlasting love, I have loved you indeed with a love that is faithful. I draw you near. A lot of times the prophets will use the image of the wilderness as a time of innocence. Not that they were so terribly innocent. If you remember what they do in the wilderness, they complain a lot, right? And they rebel against Moses. But it's nice to think back and make the past look better. Once more, I will build you up. So, you know, I've had to take you down. You've had to be punished. You've had other countries come along and, you know, use the sword to punish you, but now you're going to come back. Young maiden Israel, you will be made anew. Once more, you will take up your drums in hand and join in the dance of the joyous. Once again, you will plant vines in Samaria's hill, Samaria being part of northern Israel, and the planters will live to enjoy them. For a day is coming when watchmen will announce in the hills of Ephraim, Ephraim again being northern Israel, arise and let us go up to Zion, Zion being Jerusalem, to the Eternal our God. For thus said the Eternal, cry out in joy for Jacob, Jacob being Israel. Remember, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. He's sometimes called Jacob, sometimes called Israel. Cry out in praise over the pinnacle of the nations. Sing and shout and say with voices raised, Eternal save your people, the remnant of Israel. So it's a remnant that's going to come back. It's not everybody. I'm here to bring them back from the land of the north, to gather them from the ends of the earth, the blind and the lame among them, women who were pregnant along with birthing mothers. They shall return here, a great community. With weeping they will come, with compassion I will guide them. I will bring them on a smooth path to brooks of water. They will not falter, for I have become like a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. So God is the father and Israel is the firstborn. So the favored son, supposedly, although none of the actual firstborns are favored sons in humanity's reality. Nations, hear the word of the Eternal, declare it in the distant islands, and say, the one who scattered Israel will gather them in and guard them as a shepherd the flock. For the Eternal has redeemed Jacob and saved him from hands stronger than his own. Happy their song, etc., etc. Then maidens will dance with delight, the young and their elders. Their grief I will turn into bliss. I will comfort them and gladden them in their time of sorrow. Now, this is the important one. Verse 15. Thus says the Eternal, a voice is heard in Ramah, wailing, bitter weeping. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted for her children, for they are gone. So Rachel, remember, Jacob's supposed to be first wife, actual second wife, favored wife, who was barren for a long time, finally gave birth to Joseph. And then she gave birth, after Joseph was, disappeared by his brothers, she gave birth to Benjamin and she died in childbirth. And she is now the sort of representative of God in a certain sense, weeping for her children, because even though God had to punish us, God is sad about that. And can't be comforted. I mean, you lose your children, you're not going to be comforted. So Rachel is weeping for these children because they've gone, okay? Thus says the Eternal, keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for your labor shall have its reward, declares the Eternal. They shall return from the enemy's land, and there is hope for your future. Your children shall return to their land. So Rachel is weeping because all these people have been exiled, but God says they're going to return, feel better, okay? So, God's heard all the lamenting, but God will bring you back. Truly Ephraim, again being Israel, is my precious child, my delight, and though I speak against him, I remember him with tenderness. That is why my heart yearns for him. I will receive him back in love, declares the Eternal. So let's look at the commentary on this. So there's a focus on teshuvah in this story. Penitence and remorse, physical and spiritual return. Our sages chose words of the prophet Jeremiah, who lived toward the end of the 7th century BCE, a period of intense political turmoil. Caught between the empires of Egypt and Babylonia, the people of the southern kingdom of Judah were painfully aware of the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by Assyria a century before. So this whole business, the focus on northern California, on northern Israel, Ephraim, Samaria, that's because the north was taken over by the Assyrians. And that's when those 10 tribes disappeared and they were dispersed and conquered and never heard from again. And this is what Rachel is crying about. Addressing a people fearing for their future, Jeremiah begins by assuring them of God's enduring concern for them. With an everlasting love, I have loved you. Now, there's a rabbi who wrote a book about the abuse of God, because it's a little abusive to, punish in such a really severe way and say, but I still love you. But okay, we can maybe transcend that literal understanding.
Is that kind of tough love?
It could be tough love. It could be abusive love. I guess it's how you read it. Okay, the prophet offers a joyful vision of the return of the northern exiles and a reunited Jewish nation in which Judah and Israel, symbolized by the figures of Jacob and Ephraim, will celebrate together at the summit of Zion. In this imagined future, the rupture between the northern and southern kingdoms will be healed, and a repentant Ephraim will return to God. Remember, the people who put together the Bible were from the southern kingdom because they were the only ones left standing. So the northern kingdom is seen as having strayed really far from God. Not that the southern kingdom hasn't, but the northern kingdom is worse, which is why they've been punished so much. Of course, later the southern kingdom will also be punished, but that's another story. Okay, so this idea of Ephraim, my precious child. And so this is from Rashi. On Rosh Hashanah, the day of remembrance, we read God's words about Ephraim, symbolizing the exiled tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel, because they evoke God's remembrance and mercy, as in the phrases, my mind turned toward him in remembrance, and I will take him back with compassion and love. any responses to this whole idea of this barrenness, this mourning over lost children? I mean, some children who were born are then almost killed, and then others are disappeared because they were conquered by another country. And that's the kind of the theme for Rosh Hashanah from all of these readings. These are all the traditional readings. As I said, we don't read those two Haftorahs in our shul, but it just continues that message of barrenness and mourning and weeping and supposedly renewal and recreation. Anybody have any responses?
I think it's just kind of interesting because, I mean, this year has been especially challenging. But I think that if we look back through time at challenging years and the barrenness of some years and the loss of some years and what we experience over the course of a year, and as we then come to Rosh Hashanah, we're taking the opportunity to Teshuvah, we're looking deep inside, introspection, all the various components. I can't really think of really any better readings, because these are the topics, and they're not directly related to barrenness, but if you take it from that barrenness of the soul or the experience of what we have experienced, what we have lost, what we have gained from what we have lost. I mean, if you take it in all those different areas, and then if you look at overall the various readings we could choose, because I believe you had mentioned last year in preparation for Rosh Hashanah that we were talking about what else could we choose? You know, what else would we potentially choose for this time of year? And I don't know what there. I mean, yes, there are others, but I think this really gets into the place of that barrenness in the deepest part of the soul, deepest part of the being, deepest part of our existence.
You know, that's a really beautiful reading, because I think definitely at this time of COVID-19, the fires, everything that's going on, I mean, there is a sense of barrenness, right? I mean, we're not able to be together, right? I mean, the whole idea of giving life, I mean, it's about being together, right? And we can't do that. And there is a sense of barrenness about that this year. I think that's really perfect. I mean, at other times, you know, when things are better, you know, barrenness might represent, for example, when I was a TV producer for longer than I care to remember, and I was very unhappy. And so that's a kind of barrenness. It's like being in the wilderness, right? And then you finally get to your promised land, right? And, oh, now I feel like I can be, you know, creative and expansive because I'm doing what I really want to do, as opposed to feeling miserable for, you know, years. So I think that theme can work, you know, every year, but certainly more so this year. Absolutely. I mean, there's just so many things that are not happening, between not being able to gather, businesses closing, people being sick, not being able to visit someone in the hospital, not to be with someone when they're dying. I mean, that's a kind of barrenness as well. So
That's
I think
almost the worst, I think, for some families. I mean, I can't imagine if David got sick and I couldn't be there. I mean,
oh, absolutely. You know, people have had to, you know, someone's dying and the nurse takes an iPad or a phone and holds it there for, you know, the family to say goodbye. I mean, that's a barren way to die, without having somebody holding your hand and being there for you and hugging you. I mean, so I think that's really a beautiful reading, I think, for this year. Absolutely. And we don't read it. Now, interestingly, what did the Reform movement do? Well, let me give you, for the Torah reading anyway, let me give you something that actually is more relevant. The creation story, right? That's a perfect story for Rosh Hashanah, because Rosh Hashanah is the birthday of the world. So why not have the story of creation? But in a certain sense, the story of creation doesn't really give you all these moral dilemmas and these struggles that these other stories do. They're not as rich on a certain level. Well, unless you go into the second story and start talking about Adam and Eve and what they did. But the idea of, you know, your child almost dying or not being able to have a child, and again, thinking of it figuratively, not just literally. I mean, these are really profound issues to talk about and to wrestle with. And they really, you know, hit you deep down where you're really supposed to be exploring at this time of year. So the creation story is sort of like, oh, isn't that nice? God created the birds and the bees and the trees, and oh, it's all so perfect. God calls everything good. And then God creates these humans and they're very good. And we know damn well that's not true.
Very bad.
Yeah, and we know damn well that, you know, the Midrash is the angels say to God, well, you know, tell us about the human beings. Well, let me show you the future, God says. And they go, no, don't do it. So the creation story is kind of a nice story. Yeah, it's the birthday of the world. That's a great thing to tell little kids. But for us adults who have to struggle with these really big questions, I think these other stories are you know, kind of more appropriate, though very disturbing in many ways. So any other thoughts about these stories that we are reading, especially about women? Of course, women representing fertility, I guess. There are a lot of stories about women here, right? Yes, Teresa.
Well, I was wondering, it never has a man being unfertile, but I mean, it could have been, right? It didn't have to always be the women.
Well, if it's a patriarchal narrative, then it's always, the women are always the ones who are barren.
But if you were,
of course,
if you were a maid and you wanted to get pregnant, and your position would be better, you could find a way to get pregnant.
Well, you know, absolutely. Look, it's both sides that could have a problem, but that's not how these narratives are told, unfortunately. And by the way, notice who creates life at the very beginning of the Torah?
God.
And is God male or female?
Male.
In the Torah, God is male, okay? I mean, we can now say, oh, God is not male, God is not female, but in the Torah, God is a male. So a male has taken over the function of creating life. Let that rattle around in your head. Alejandra, did you have something? Oh, okay. Yeah, so it's, you know, actually, you know, when God says at the beginning of the Torah, let us create whatever, why is it in the we form? So there are different explanations, but one is that it's a leftover from the days when God had a female consort, because in the pagan religions, there was a female consort who actually was the one who gave life, not the male. But that got eliminated. Okay, so it's almost 8:30. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I do want to let you know that next week, on Wednesday evening, I'm going to be talking about Sodom and Gomorrah and how that is related to the Akedah, which is based on a session that I sat in on. And it's an interesting perspective. And then Thursday night, Jason Winston is going to do some Musar teaching. Musar is developing moral traits. And in the meantime, tomorrow night, Rosh Hashanah, 7:30 sharp. So I wish you all a Shana Tova. I look forward to seeing
you, Rabbi.
And
Thank you.
Rabbi.
so much.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Good night.
Good night.
Shana Tova.
Aroma.